tweeting with Tim Flannery, but I encourage him to follow me on Twitter. But it is a big thrill to be able to introduce him to you all this morning. He's one of Australia's leading writers on climate change. He's an internationally acclaimed scientist. He's an explorer and a conservationist, and he was Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held various academic positions, which I won't go into now because that'd involve reading them out, and that's boring. But he's also currently Chief Commissioner of the Australian Climate Commission, and that is, in fact, a very large part of what we're all here about this morning. So what are the opportunities in clean energy? I think that's a burning question in everyone's minds. So rather than me witter on about it, I would ask Professor Tim Flannery to come and give us the lowdown.
Thank you. Good. Well, what a great morning we've had this morning. You know, if I was trying to just summarise what I'd heard from the various speakers, and it seems to me there's a pretty strong message there, which is that we have some really serious sustainability problems, not just in the environmental area, but in the social area as well. And that those problems, in many instances, are building towards a crisis situation. But that the solutions to a lot of those problems are often very local. So it is action at this sort of level that ultimately will make a difference. We can't just think, oh, we wait for the government to do it, or wait for America to do it, or wait for China to do it. These days, in this interconnected, globalised world we live in, things don't work like that. We actually have to start doing it if we want an outcome. And it's really in that context that I wanted to talk today about clean energy and the clean energy future. On Monday this week, the Australian Climate Commission released a report that we'd been working on for many months, which dealt with action on climate change around the world. We wanted to release that report for a couple of reasons. As we travelled around Australia over the last 18 months, we'd heard again and again from people a few myths that we thought needed to be dispelled. One was that Australia was just too small to matter in the world. I don't know, I don't think we're the only country that talks itself down like that, talks ourselves down, but it's amazing when you go around and say, oh, we're just too small to matter. I mean, the fact is that Australia is the 15th largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. Yeah? And if we take it on a per capita basis, we are by far the largest. So we are big, we're in the top 20 heavyweights, we really do count. The world looks to us to see what we're doing about our particular problems here. And we're watched very carefully. So that was one myth we wanted to deal with. The other big myth was that, oh, nothing's happening anyway. China keeps on polluting, the US isn't going to legislate a climate bill and so forth, so it's all hopeless. And again, we found that just was not right. If you look at what's happening in places like China, there is a tremendous move towards a clean energy future. I'll talk more about some specific details of that later, but it probably gives you a sense of where things are now, just to realise that in China, they have committed to a 45% reduction in carbon intensity for their economy. What that means is huge efficiency gains, basically. Emissions will continue to grow because China is a rapidly growing economy, the manufacturing of the world, but they'll grow much more slowly than a business-as-usual case, putting China in a position to drop its emissions, hopefully in the decade beginning 2020. They're also number one in the world by far and away for new clean energy installations. They're number one in the world for wind. In fact, half of the wind towers that have gone in globally last year went in China. There are huge changes going on in that country. In the US, people harp on about how the Republicans and Conservatives are stopping a cap and trade bill being passed through the Senate there. And that is true, that is happening. We all have to live with our crosses to bear, and the US has a particular one there. But that doesn't mean that action on climate change isn't happening. In fact, if you take the US as a whole, 70% of carbon emissions in the US are covered by regulation already. So there's a lot of action happening at the federal level. New CAFE standards, new standards for coal-fired power plants in terms of mercury emissions and so forth. having a big impact there. And coal use is declining. We've seen just last year in the US 20% less coal burned than the year before. A number of reasons for that, again, I'll come back to later. There's also regional carbon trading schemes happening. California's carbon trading scheme opens this year. That economy is far larger than Australia, very, very influential player in the world. If you look at emissions overall in the US, they're achieving the targets they set themselves. The US set out to reduce their emissions by 17% below 2005 levels by the end of this decade. They're already reduced emissions by 7.6%. So they are on track to achieve what they pledged. So the world is moving. And the US and China between them make up around about 37% of global emissions. So with the big players moving, the next strength, the middle tier of which Australia is part, needs to move as well. I think looking back at this year particularly, it's likely that people will see this as a sort of tipping point year in some ways, not just for clean energy systems, and I'll talk about that soon, but also for the Earth's climate system. Changes in the Northern Hemisphere this year have been really quite exceptional. You may have read earlier in the year that carbon dioxide concentrations over the Arctic Ocean reached 400 parts per million for the first time this year, and that concentration will spread southwards over time, and eventually, or not eventually, very soon, we'll have a CO2 concentration of beyond 400 parts per million. We also saw earlier this year that the Greenland Ice Cap did something which no one had ever seen before. 97% of the surface of the Greenland Ice Cap melted during July this year. Previous years, the average area of melt has been below 40%. So this was a real jump in terms of the amount of the surface of the ice cap that melted. Listen to the news in a week or so's time, because we'll have then the August figures for the extent of the Arctic ice sheet. The trend at the moment is very serious. It's at record low levels now. It looks like August will be a month of record low levels. By mid-September, at the time of maximum melt of the sea ice in the Arctic, we look set again to set another record in that area. Things may change, of course, but dealing with the data now, it's looking as if this will be a year of record low ice extent in the Arctic. Further south, in the Northern Hemisphere, there are very dramatic changes afoot as well. I'll just deal with North America because of time constraints here, but if you look at the US, 63% of the US is now in drought. Sounds more like Australia to me than the United States. Water levels in the Mississippi River have fallen so low that grain can no longer be shipped from the Midwest to the rest of the world. These are exceptional circumstances. And if you look at temperature records across the US, we see that we have had record high temperatures for the month of July right across the country. And in fact, for much of the year, we've had very, very high temperature records with over 3,200 individual temperature records for reasons falling this year due to that heat wave that the country is now suffering. The climate scientists have done statistical analyses on that and said, is it possible that these record high temperatures are part of some sort of natural cycle? The answer is a resounding no. The chances of it being natural are very, very small indeed. It's almost certain to be a result of the additional greenhouse gases that humans have put in the atmosphere. So all of those trends are changing perceptions in the US. There is growing concern again about the climate, and we shall see where that takes us. But the one thing that's certain is that our climate system is changing very swiftly. Some aspects of it changing more swiftly than we could have imagined even 5 years earlier. And thankfully, the source of the problem is also changing, not as fast as we'd like, but it is changing. We found, as we did our report on how countries are coming to terms with climate change and acting, that 90 countries now, which in aggregate are responsible for about 93% of the global economic activity, have climate programs in place. So if you meet a climate skeptic or climate denier who's still arguing about the science, my message now is that it really doesn't matter. The world has already started on its journey. We're seeing this happening. As of next year, there'll be 850 million people living in economies with a carbon price. And that, of course, includes Australia. Australia being the 33rd country to establish a carbon price. So we're not leading, we're in the middle of the pack as far as that goes. In terms of the cost of carbon price, you've really got to look across the cost of all initiatives a government takes to get a sense of where we stand vis-a-vis others. The argument's often made that Australia has a very high price. That doesn't stack up when you look across the band of initiatives. In fact, Australia's about in the middle of the pack for that, round about the middle. In terms of individual carbon taxes, ours is currently $23 a tonne. But if you want to look at a country with a high carbon tax, Scandinavia is full of them. The oldest carbon tax was established in Finland in 1990. The largest carbon tax is on fossil fuels for heating purposes in Sweden of $147 a tonne. And incidentally, Sweden has halved its emissions in recent decades, halved its CO2 emissions. At the same time, it's outperformed the 7 largest OECD countries in terms of economic performance, which shows you it actually can be done. If you want to look at decoupling emissions growth from economic growth, there are great examples. In fact, 12 of the world's largest economies last year decoupled emissions growth from economic growth. So we see this trend continuing to take place. I mentioned that China was investing large amounts of money in renewable energy. One of the things that's really happened there that I think is a game changer in and of itself and represents a sort of a tipping point really in terms of energy systems is what's happened to the cost of solar panels in China and the cost of production particularly. Over the last 4 years alone, we've seen a drop in the cost of production of solar panels of 75%. You know? That's a bit like, imagine going into a shop and buying something for $10 4 years ago, going back and buying it for $2.50 this year. Those sort of reductions are very substantial. No one saw them coming. If you look at projections for growth in solar, this is broken the model, broken our previous understanding of how quickly prices could shift. And as they start to shift, you get some very substantial uptake in solar technologies. You may have read that last year Australia led the world in terms of the number of installations of solar panels. Most of ours are very small, they're rooftop solar. Nevertheless, we had more of them. We put more in place last year than any other country on Earth. Some 750,000 households in Australia now have solar panels on the roof. So they are dramatic changes. What do they mean in terms of a major shift away from the conventional energy systems to something different? We have to remember that the current energy system we have is not all that old. It took shape in the 1940s and 50s as snowy hydro came on and as the big coal-fired power plants were being built around the country. And there'll only be one generation of coal-fired power plants in Australia. That will be it. We'll shift to gas or renewables in future. My guess is increasingly renewables because the price of the fossil fuels is going up, the price of the renewables is coming down, straight-out economics is going to drive it. I think we get a bit of a glimpse of the future from Germany. In Germany, they've recently moved away from nuclear power as a potential source. They've said politically they don't want to do that. And what has transpired there is the need for a new energy plan because Germany already has 25 gigawatts of solar power, 25 gigawatts of wind. That's enough to run the Australian economy on a lazy day. That's quite a lot. And because of the nature of the energy market in Germany, that's become quite profitable, distributed energy, but the traditional energy companies are really struggling to make a profit just because of the way the market works. So what we're seeing there is that there's a fundamental incompatibility between a distributed grid with clean energy and the conventional old fossil fuel grid. I think that situation will reach a tipping point in Germany fairly soon. And the Germans are great planners. The governments of Germany, provincial and federal, and the big industrial companies and communities are coming together right now to develop a new energy plan for Germany that will almost certainly embed the distributed grid at the centre of the new German energy system. It's going to be immensely challenging. No one knows how to do that yet. But I think smart grid technologies and the distributed energy systems are in place give us a sense that it will succeed. In Australia, we're already experimenting with these sorts of grids. Pacific Hydro are working on King Island right now to develop a 100% renewable energy grid with storage capacity and enough capacity to run the major industries of the island, dairying, abattoir, so forth, as well as serve the 2,000 odd people that live on that island. These are challenging projects. Again, no one knows quite how to do this, but the importance of regional communities in pioneering this knowledge shouldn't be underestimated. Everyone is going to need this sort of technology in future as we shift to a clean energy economy. The role of regional communities is extremely important because of the manageable size of those communities and the capacity that you have to, if you want, experiment, make investments and see what happens. And of course, it's in the interests of those communities to do just that. I know that in Bathurst here, about $50 million a year is spent on energy, and that all leaves your community. It's a bit like Tuvalu. You know, whenever the old freighter comes in with all of the diesel fuel to run the diesel generators on Tuvalu, people say the money goes out of the economy. There they see it, you know, once every 6 months or so, the money's sucked out. Here, because it's a slow bleed for you, it just happens, you know, with the normal electricity bill, you don't see it, you don't feel it. But if you were generating energy here in your local community in a distributed grid situation, you'd be keeping the money in the local community and enriching yourselves in that way. So there's a big driver for those sort of experiments that we see on places like King Island and elsewhere, which will be needed at ever greater scale. We'll have to learn how to do it not just on King Island, but in communities with tens of thousands of people and ultimately in cities with millions of people. When I say ultimately, I don't know how far that is off. It may be 10, 20, possibly 30 years off, but I suspect we'll see it sooner rather than later. At the same time this is happening, we're seeing tremendous advances in terms of energy efficiency right across Australian industries. I saw the most amazing example last month in Melbourne where we went to One Steel at Laverton, steelmaker, who had been saving 20% of greenhouse gas emissions with one simple innovation. They'd shandied their coking coal, which is traditionally what they used to get the oxygen off the iron, you know, to reduce the iron, were shandying that with 35% old tyres. And because old tyres have a lot of hydrogen in them, this was a fantastic outcome. Much better reductant. It's a better foaming agent. It saves on their electrodes. Their electrodes last longer. It keeps temperatures in. They were saving 2 or 3% on electricity costs. And when you're running a 33 megawatt facility, that is really, really big news. Energy equals money. Companies are finding ways of doing this in ever more innovative fashions. And in the case of One Steel, if I could just say, they're a recycler anyway. With their arc furnaces, they take old steel and old iron and recycle it, so tyres have steel bands. It was the perfect match made in heaven just to add another recycling component into this. They've recycled now 1.5 million tyres, saved 20% of their emissions, and that technology is now going global. It's already been licensed to Thailand and Taiwan, and we'll see it, I think, alter the nature of steel making in arc furnaces as things go on. So that's just one tiny example. But as you get those reductions in electricity demand, again, it changes the synergy in the system. So growing distributed grid, reduction in energy demand, changing meaning of baseload, and we'll get onto that if we've got time, smart grid technologies that allow us to monitor and manipulate demand as well as supply, all of those things are going to change our lives and I think have the capacity to deliver a zero emissions grid to a country like Australia sooner rather than later. So we're at this tipping point. How do we, as a people, make sure that we grasp the maximum opportunity out of this and avoid the pitfalls of poor investment and so forth? As Climate Commissioner, travelling around Australia, the communities that I've seen do this well are those that work together. And the example we saw from Port Kembla of community gardening is a superb example of a community working together to achieve an outcome. You'll also see down in the Illawarra BlueScope Steel, major employers like that, working with universities, working with local councils, working with communities to improve the outcomes and avoid the sort of disastrous things that happened there in the 80s when there was massive retrenchment and that unemployment that we're still living with today was established. So to me, the key is working together. All of these communities need leaders. I hope someone will jump up in a place like Bathurst and say, okay, this community could really benefit from a community-owned wind farm or some sort of aggregate sense of photovoltaic deployment across the town, or some sort of biomass generation plant or whatever. But to get in there first, be innovative, work together, take advantage of the incentives that are there right now for communities like this to start moving. Because if we don't do that, what we'll see is the power price just going up and up and up, and the money going out of the community, and ultimately, when we have to adjust, it will be very painful and very expensive. So early action on climate change, early action in terms of positioning your community to take advantage of this is far more cost-effective and far less painful than just waiting, particularly in a situation where the world is inevitably changing. This, as I said, we've passed the tipping point now. More money was spent on renewable energy last year globally than was invested in fossil fuels. We're past the tipping point, it's inevitable, and the time's come to act. Thank you very much.